De jó öreg módszer bejött.
Okay, let's start, and maybe some other participants will join us. So hello everyone, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are. My name is Erik Uszkiewicz. I'm one of the two vice chairpersons of the Hungarian Europe Society, and I will be the moderator of this session, which is also part of our Uncertain Times project with the generous support of the US Embassy of Budapest. Just some housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphone unless speaking. And please keep in mind that this afternoon session, this webinar will be recorded, and we will distribute the record on the Hungarian Europe Society's social media channels. If you would like to ask, then please type your question in the Q&A box. And as time permits, the questions will be addressed and answered after the short briefings. Just to start this webinar, a short introduction. The Hungarian society, as our everyday experience proves, is strongly and differentially prejudiced. Representing the situation of the minorities in Hungary with its all social, economic and political aspects would definitely go beyond the scope of this webinar. However, with our three distinguished speakers, we undertake mapping the causes and consequences of the minorities' neuralgic situation in the Hungarian society. Although this situation was not even shiny before the current COVID-19 pandemic, during the last couple of months, public sentiment turned against some minority groups in an even harsher way, which groups have been already marginalized in many aspects. And as part of the fight against the virus, number of measures have been introduced targeting minority groups disproportionately, much more severely, or without any reasonable explanation. For example, related to the Roma community in Slovakia, using the army was not considered as an overreaction. In Bulgaria, the government has set up roadblocks and police checkpoints around several Roma neighborhoods, and even one of the Hungarian MEPs hinted that the Roma ghettos could turn out to be the real nest of contagiation. Meanwhile, in Hungary, we are witnessing further drastic deteriorations in the status of the most disadvantaged and marginalized societal group. Accidentally, just in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak, two major events defined the public discourse on Roma. The Hungarian Supreme Court decided on third instance in one of the most influential Roma school segregation case, and after a fatal fight between rival groups of young people in Budapest, the voices echoing gypsy criminality have been intensified. The situation of the Hungarian LGBTQI community was also in decline even before the pandemic. As a consequence of the deteriorating situation, there was a dramatic drop in the score Rainbow Europe 2020 assigned to Hungary, losing 8.46 points in relation to the suspended procedure for legal gender recognition and the lack of proper straight protection at public events. In many cases, after 2010, the police did not authorize the Budapest Pride March in the city center, despite the fact that the event could have been held by rulings of the court and thus violating the freedom of assembly. In addition, in recent years, an increasingly hostile rhetoric dominated the political speech. But the situation deteriorated with measures adopted under the pretext to fight against the pandemic. Similarly to the Hungarian case, the pandemic hit Poland at a time where hostilities rose high against the LGBTQI community. It's sufficient to remember the creation of the so-called LGBT-free zones, where Polish municipalities and regions openly declared their hostility. Several international organizations, local politicians, and people protested against such obvious incitement to hatred. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated in her 2020 State of the Union speech that LGBTQI-free zones are humanity-free zones and they have no place in our union. And finally, scapegoating during epidemics is nothing new. Historically, xenophobia and racial prejudice have been associated with infectious disease outbreaks, amongst other Jews. For example, during the medieval plague, pogroms were organized based on the conspiracy theory that the disease was deliberately spread by Jews through well poisoning. Currently, we are witnessing in parallel with the epidemic control the stigmatization and humiliation of certain societal groups by the public, and in the political discourse too, blaming them to be responsible for the epidemic. The Anti-Defamation League already reported several cases from all over the world already in March 2020, where Zionists or Israel were accused of developing or spreading the virus. After this short and very generic introduction, during our conversation, we will mostly focus on Hungary, occasionally with a regional outlook. Let me introduce our speakers today in order of the short presentations. First, Henriett Dinók, who is the director of Romaversitas Foundation. She is a lawyer, political scientist, and a human rights activist. As a young researcher, she started her career at the Institute for Legal Studies at Hungarian Academy of Sciences, studying criminal and constitutional law in a comparative context. She spent a year conducting her PhD research on hate crimes at the University of Alberta, Canada. Bea Sándor, who is the legal program director at Háttér Society. She graduated in 2014 at the Faculty of Law of ELTE University. Earlier, she had worked as a literary scholar and translator, and holds a PhD in English literature and an MA degree in gender studies from the Central European University. She has been working as a project coordinator and legal expert for Háttér Society's legal program since February 2015. And finally, we have Anikó Félix, who is a sociologist, received her PhD in sociology from Eötvös-Loránd University. Her main fields of expertise are the contemporary far-right movement, subculture, and parties, with a huge focus on their gender aspects, right-wing populism, and anti-Semitism. Currently, she is the executive director at Goldziher Institute. Just as during our previous webinars, now I will ask in this order our distinguished speakers to summarize their written papers in approximately 8-10 minutes. So first, Henriett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you for the introduction. And welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be virtually here. I don't even know what's the proper English expression anymore for these circumstances. It's great to see so many familiar faces and see new faces, and I'm multitasking between two screens, so I'm able to see every faces all the time. So when I was asked to participate in this discussion, I think the organizers were really generous about the framework in which we can choose our directions and topic about inclusiveness and its challenges and the state of minorities in the so-called Western world. And despite I think the big playing field, as you could see from our written contributions, our papers ended up resonating with each other, which is not accidental. And I think it shows the dimensions of challenges for minorities in Hungary and in Central Eastern Europe. And also shows how deeply rooted are these challenges in our, in this case, in our country, but in all the CE countries. So I think it's, given my introduction, it's not surprising that I chose to talk about anti-Gypsyism, because as a leader of a Roma organization and then as an expert in the field of hate-motivated crimes, I believe that for our communities, for Roma communities, the biggest challenge nowadays is the deeply rooted anti-Gypsyism, and it creates the roots for everything. 41% of Roma in Central Eastern European countries experienced discrimination, felt discriminated at least once in the past 5 years, according to the Fundamental Rights Agency. And 54% of Hungarian would not be willing to accept the Roma as their family members. 44% don't want Roma as neighbors, and 27% of cities, they don't want to be, Roma to be citizens of their own country. So this is our starting point. This is the clear manifestation of anti-Roma feelings in Hungary. But let me provide you with a definition of anti-Gypsyism, because there's a lot of debate around what is anti-Gypsyism is, and there is one very complex definition, which says anti-Gypsyism is a historically constructed, persistent, complex of customary racism against social groups identified under the stigma of Gypsy. It's under the stigma of Gypsy because in many countries there are different names for Roma people. And so that's why it says like under the stigma of Gypsies and other related terms that incorporates homogenizing and essentializing perception and description of these groups, the attribution of specific characteristic to Roma, and I will use Roma. I'm not going to use Roma and Sinti, Roma and travelers. So I'm going to stick to Roma because of the Hungarian background. And the third one is discriminating social structures and violent practices that emerge against that background, which have a degrading and ostracizing effect and which reproduce social disadvantages. And I would like to highlight, let's say, two phenomena for it. One is racism that is complex enough to understand what's going on here, and structural historical disadvantages. So, and I chose political discourse in my approach because I believe that politicians play an important role in fighting against anti-Gypsyism or reproducing it in some cases, especially in the Hungarian and, for example, Polish cases. And or we saw examples in Slovakia as well. So politicians, especially governing party representatives, are an elite group that control or have access to many types of public discourse, and they have the largest stake in maintaining white group dominance. In the same way, I don't know, professors controls academic discourse, or legal or lawyers control legal discourse, and journalists control media discourse, except in Hungary, I guess, or where there is a lack of freedom of media in some countries. So politicians control policy and other political discourse. So it's a simple equation. Those who have more control over more discourse, they have more power. And this we can see a color, for example, in Hungary. So I went back to the results of one of my previous research that focused on the government discourse on hatred and bias against Roma, and also the Jewish and LGBTQI communities in Hungary. So I wanted to show how deeply rooted and easily used anti-Gypsyism as a tool, as a means in Hungarian political discussion. And also I found it easier to connect to my colleagues with this research. So this very short overview of the analysis of the last 8 years of government communication on its official website shows that anti-Gypsyism is a tool for the governing political party to reinforce its own conservative and, in the last couple of years, far-right messages and ideology. The government's narrative on Roma shows that Roma mostly ancillary to every discourse, which itself proves anti-Gypsyism. Roma have any legitimacy by themselves in the discourse. They exist as a supplementary topic, only means in the eyes of the governing political party. And I strongly believe that one of the achievements of this government also happened accidentally because of this discourse. In 2015, Hungary took over the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance chairmanship, and in that period, in that year, it's significantly influenced how the government communicated about the Jewish community, about anti-Semitism and hate-motivated acts and about the Holocaust. So the positive outcome was that they basically acknowledged the Roma victims of the Holocaust. But I think it happened because they wanted to create an international narrative on Hungary's progressive approach to anti-Semitism, and somehow the Roma just slipped into that discourse. So I don't know, finally we were lucky in the last 500 years in Hungary. So, but that was a clear, yeah, that's a positive achievement. However, the discourse was quickly overtaken by the xenophobic and anti-refugee campaign. The government developed the frame in which the reason for rejection to EU quotas were for refugees was that Hungary cannot receive migrants because the country quote has to take care of the integration of 800,000 gypsy people. So in the context of migration, they are framed as a problem for the country that must be solved first. And from 2016, the narrative was overwhelmingly dominated by the government's anti-refugee campaign. All the topics that I identified earlier in their communication was basically overruled by the anti-refugee campaign. And the government seized every possible opportunity to talk about it and the so-called illegal migrant agenda. Generally, this illegal migration narrative basically utilized Roma to reinforce both the rejection of refugees and reinforce the stereotypes of Roma. So the primary consideration was that the integration of Roma is such a demanding task that it hampers the integration of refugees. And given the weight, and we all know the narratives about refugees in Hungary, given how negative it was, just tied to the Roma community is in itself obviously recreating a very, very, very anti-Gypsist narrative. And so from 2018, the intensity of the anti-refugee campaign, can you help me, Erik? Do I have like 2 minutes? Yes. So the anti-refugee campaign and narrative had decreased, abated, and anti-Gypsism, on the other hand, unequivocally got stronger. And it's the mentioned Gyöngyöspata case. In 2020 January, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán reacted to the judgment of the Court of Appeal that concerned compensation of Romani families and their children who were forced into segregated education. So he created a narrative about the compensation, again, court ruled compensation that focused on unearned revenue, claiming that Roma people gain money without work in the form of compensation. The Prime Minister also criticized later the court's ruling and stated that it's deeply unfair. And I found the quote, "I don't know yet exactly what to do now, but this cannot remain like this for sure. We need to give justice to the Gyöngyöspata people." And he didn't mean like the Roma people in Gyöngyöspata, but the majority. And he also promised that the government would amend the law so similar cases would never happen again. In the same interview, he said that it is again a quote, "It is a question whether Hungarians can feel home in their own country, and if Hungary is a place where a minority can force its will on the majority." So that happened last year. So over in the last 8 years, the narrative on Roma was undoubtedly reinforcing directly or indirectly anti-Gypsism. There were also attempts for moderate acknowledgement, but that was really weak and definitely overweighted by the negative narratives. And the government, actually, it was even surprising for me that the government turned the narrative dangerous to the radical right in the year of the pandemic, when people were desperately looking for scapegoats. In parallel with the diminishing or like decreasing, diminishing returns of the from the demonizing migrants, the government prompted to anti-Gypsyism and pointed to the finger to another enemy. And the biggest problem with this kind of scapegoating, and why it is very dangerous, because this new enemy actually lives in the country. The new enemy is your neighbor. The new enemy is the neighbor of those people who were incited against Roma. I don't know, it just seems that especially in the last couple of years, the Hungarian society seemed to be a perfect soil for, and not just anti-Roma racism, but for hatred generally to flourish. And it sounds like a cliche, but for me, it seems like the only certainty in these uncertain times is anti-Gypsyism. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. During the conversation after the presentations, we can go back this new phenomena that the governing parties appropriate some elements, messages, and symbols of the far right scene and discourse. And there was another symbolic and very important event last year when the Prime Minister was talking about the jail business as well. So we can talk about this as well later, but now let's continue with the LGBT community. And I have to say that I very much appreciated and loved the title of Bea's article, short article, which reflects to our webinar series, the title of our webinar series, because she has written her paper with the title Very Uncertain Times, the situation of LGBTQI people in Hungary in 2020-2021. So even the title suggests that the picture, what Bea will draw us in the next couple of minutes, won't be shiny at all.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I did give this title because, yes, we have the sense that that these are very uncertain times. And as Henriett has already talked about, it was well, not a surprise, but still something that is pleasurous to recognize, to see how our summaries, our papers resonate with each other. Because although it's not unique in the world that there are governmental actors that make use of the vulnerability of different social minorities and mobilize their constituencies around xenophobia, anti-migrant sentiments, anti-Roma sentiments, and anti-LGBT and anti-Semitic sentiments of the society, and strengthen it. It's unfortunately not completely unique in the world, but still I'd say that Hungary has a special place, especially as a member of the EU, in this very, very sad competition. So this is what has been going on. The government has been mobilizing against LGBTI people in Hungary for the last couple of years. It can be seen from the first instance of the so-called gender ideology narratives, when they began to use this word it was more or less two years ago. It was in the autumn of 2018 that all gender studies programs were outlawed in Hungary, completely shut down and banned. And then came the rejection of a long discussion about the rejection of the Istanbul Convention, which was then completely rejected by Hungary, by the parliament, during last year, with reference to the existence of gender, the word gender in the treaty, and that it would oblige Hungary to receive refugees persecuted on the grounds of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Then came the legislation banning legal gender recognition for trans people in May 2020, completely unprecedented in Europe. It's usually there are legal changes that are in favor of the self-determination of people regarding their gender identity, but in Hungary it was completely banned. And these moves and rhetoric have been constantly accompanied by fear-mongering in pro-government and sometimes far-right pro-government outlets about the powerful gender lobby, as well as attacks by extremist groups, sometimes by especially during the Pride events of the last couple of years. So all these really make the advocacy efforts and promoting the human rights and the equality of LGBTI people very difficult in Hungary. And also they generally endanger a vision of equality in Hungarian society. In my summary, I gave ample examples, I think, of in the first chapter, intolerant speech by political actors. For example, the House Speaker said that same-sex couples raising children are pedophiles, or the Prime Minister said that homosexuals should leave our children alone, depicting LGBTI people as a threat to children and family values. Different pro-government news portals and news outlets have been talking about LGBTI people as somehow a form of an ideology, and claim that LGBTI organizations are a threat to society and children. And these statements are, of course, particularly harmful because LGBTI people are a minority that especially face discrimination in Hungarian society. The ban on legal gender recognition, I also described it in my summary. The new legislation says that sex at birth needs to be registered, and then this is a piece of data that can never be changed anymore, which is extremely harmful to, of course, to trans people who face everyday discrimination and violence because of the discrepancy between their identification papers and appearance. So whenever they pay with a bank card, get a letter that they need to sign for, or have to be identified for any sort of reason, they always have to state that I am transgender because my appearance is not in line with my papers and name, which was even criticized by recently by the Hungarian Data Protection Authority. Then I also detailed some examples when the freedom of expression is under threat. For example, when a company, Coca-Cola, was imposed a serious fine because of a campaign that ran an ad with LGBT couples, just two faces, two gay men and two lesbian women drinking cola together. And the name of the campaign was Love is Love, and the company was fined because the authority found that these advertisements are a danger to the physical, mental, emotional, and moral development of children and adolescents. Also, it's not unprecedented. It's been followed up by another similar legal case against a TV channel, the largest commercial channel, which ran a campaign on rainbow families. And now it has to face probably some sort of fine because this was a public service advertisement broadcasted, aired before 9 o'clock, and then thus endangering children. Or there's the infamous fairy tale book case when both extremist conservative parties and the government attacked this fairy tale book, and the Consumer Protection Authority ordered that they have to changed the cover of the book because it contains characters from various minorities. It's a fairy tale book depicting characters who are, some of them are LGBTI, some of them are Roma, some of them adopted, some of them live with disabilities. And the Consumer Protection Authority says that the book of the cover should be changed and clearly state that it includes patterns of behavior deviating from traditional gender roles. So it's that's a really serious case regarding consumer protection. Also, there are legislative changes that are not only a threat but limit the rights of same-sex parents and their children. Actually, the new legislative changes in the law related to adoption says that basically individuals cannot adopt anymore in Hungary, or only with the special permission of the family minister, the minister responsible for family issues, who said that, of course, she would never let any LGBTI person to adopt. So it's basically, adoption is open to only married couples or those who the minister responsible for family issues admits to adopt. And then I also, so it's a lot of factors that come together that make times very uncertain for LGBTI people. I wrote shortly about the study on online hate speech. We participate in a monitoring exercise where we monitor whether social media platforms remove hate speech when we report it or not. And we could see this time, and there was this 6-week period of monitoring has just ended, and we could see that there's because of the government, pro-government media and extremist media, there's a number of serious hate crime, hate speech incidents that we could register. And it's really much more. So this clearly shows the impact of the government's intolerant attitude and hate speech. So in summary, we can see that that there's this the encouragement given to anti-LGBTI hate speech by political and government-supported actors and media actors, smear campaigns directed against either generally against NGOs, human rights NGOs, or LGBTQI organizations by the government and extremist parties and organizations, legislative changes banning legal gender recognition, and also legislative changes banning adoption by same-sex couples, and building this anti-LGBTQI defense of children argument in the fundamental law. It is there's this relatively new change that intends to kind of threat teachers who work in schools to threaten them if they bring up LGBTI issues in educational institutions. And the growth of anti-LGBT hate speech in online media platforms. All these create very uncertain times to the LGBTI population as well in Hungary.
Thank you so much. In the chat box, I will share with you a new publication, a new paper which was published just yesterday, and it's very interesting because next to this human rights related approach, which was highlighted by Bea in the paper, in her paper and in her presentation as well. So this new study provides a new type of approach or a new kind of set of argumentation, which is the economic approach, because in this research paper, if you will check it, you can see the cost of the LGBT discrimination in terms of the GDP in 4 countries in the CE region. Next to Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, and Poland were examined, were analyzed. And they found that from 0.43% to 1.75% annual GDP is the cost of the LGBTQI discrimination in the CE region. You can find all of the details in the research paper. So I just wanted to highlight that next to this classical human rights approach and the human rights argumentation, maybe on the horizon, we can see a new type of set of argumentations as well. After the third presentation in the Q&A session, we will go back to the LGBT issues as well. But now I would like to ask Anikó to speak about the anti-Semitism in Hungary.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the other two presenters too. I would also like to emphasize that it's very important how these three papers are connected, and also, at least from researcher point of view, it's also fascinating how they are relating into each other, the different enemy pictures, and how it's connected in the political discourse that was discussed previously. So yeah, in my text, I was also talking about the political discourse first and foremost, which very much related to the other two presentations. The second part was about the anti-Semitic acts and incidents in the last few years. The third is about the attitudinal level of anti-Semitism. So these three, I hope we can have a kind of whole picture of the story. But I started the paper with a little bit of historical background, which is also important to add to the picture. But I won't go to the details now with this historical background. Just I want to mention one period which called the Horthy era. The Horthy regime was named after the governor Horthy, Miklós Horthy, who was the leader of the country between the two world wars until 1944, which is very important in the current memory politics. And it's important to highlight that anti-Semitism was very prevalent on that period, during that period. And with this, and knowing that is very important for the current political discourse, we can understand the way how some anti-Semitic acts are prevalent in nowadays Hungarian society, and also how anti-Semitism is treated as it is treated nowadays. So the first one is about the political discourse and the political acts. Broadly speaking, we can say that in the region, and the Central and Eastern European region, the most important responsible actors for anti-Semitism are the far-right actors. In a simple way, we can say that. And if we go back after the regime change, so if we follow the history of the far right, we follow the history of anti-Semitism in a way, in case of Hungary. So if we start with the regime change, we can see that there was, in the 90s, there was a party which was the most important actor of far right and anti-Semitism, was the Hungarian Justice and Life Party, which was a traditional anti-Semitic party, mostly focusing on conspiratorial type of anti-Semitism. And I would mention here the name of George Soros first. This party was very much emphasizing his background power, and the conspiracy myths around him was very important part of the rhetoric of the party. And I will come back later to this, this name when I'm talking about the current phenomenon. The second one's about the 2000s, when another party came to the picture called Jobbik, which was not then far-right party, and there was a big network of far-right organization against around Jobbik, and anti-Semitism was again a bit important part of their rhetoric. And we arrived to the third part, the third time period, which is still ongoing, and it's related to the other two presentations, which is from 2013. From the far-right point of view, it meant that Jobbik, this far-right party, shifted to the mainstream or started to soften its image to be seen as less radical, which meant for the far-right organizations a little bit of change, and they were kind of left alone. And one type of strategy that they used was to somehow they tried to, still trying to revitalize this kind of network that Jobbik somehow created. And anti-Semitism is an important ideological element for the party, which is the party of Jobbik, if you want. The pre-version of Jobbik is the Our Homeland Party. So this is the most, the Our Homeland Party, I would say, according to the analysis that we did with the Jewish Federation that will be published soon about the data collection of the 2020 and 2019 years of anti-Semitic incidents, Our Homeland Party was the most important actor in case of anti-Semitic acts. However, if we go back to this third time period that I mentioned now, another shift happened in the political palette, which is the shift of the governing coalitions, Fidesz and Christian Democrats, that was already mentioned, the refugee anti-immigrant rhetoric during and after the refugee crisis, which is part of a kind of securitization rhetoric, which has other enemy pictures also, like the LGBTI community too. And part of this rhetoric is that there are some invisible background powers behind these enemies, and one of them again is George Soros, and this is a multi-year-long campaign against him, in which some kind of anti-Semitic elements also appear, but the government heavily rejects that there is an anti-Semitic campaign, and they say that it has nothing to do with his Jewish origin. However, if we don't want to say anything on that, but as a consequence of this campaign, certainly anti-Semitic attitudes can grow. And I will go back to this a little bit later also. So another field where this current regime is acting and anti-Semitism come to the picture is related to the Horthy regime and the memory politics around the Horthy regime that I mentioned in the beginning, which is, as according to Monika Kovács, we can call it as a local remembrance strategy, which is there is some efforts to somehow next to this to join to the global remembrance strategies about the Holocaust and about the Second World War, which there are examples of this about the commemoration days, the joining to the IRA. It was mentioned before, the 2015 IRA year in Hungary, and this kind of next to this kind of efforts, there are some very controversial remembrance strategies of the government, and this is what Monika Kovács called local remembrance. The main idea of this to minimize the responsibility of the Hungarian society in the Holocaust, and also sometimes deny it, and portraying Hungary and Hungarian nation as a victim of the Second World War too. So these kind of two main directions that I want to mention regarding the political discourse of the current government. And talking about the incidents, it's also important that the relative ratio and the absolute number of the incidents are lower than in Western Europe. So it's also a regional thing. And with this, we should not say that it's less prevalent or it's less important, but it's different. And not only the numbers, but the types of the anti-Semitic incidents are also different from Western Europe. Namely that physical attacks are the number of physical attacks are very low. However, the type of conspiracy myths, hate speech, and anti-Semitism in the public discourse that I already tried to illustrate previously, it's an issue and it's important. From the governing coalitions, what is connected to this local way of remembrance, the important incidents from the last 2 years connected to the heroization of those historical figures who had somehow partly, directly or indirectly, part in the Holocaust, or somehow they were even war criminals, and they are glorified, and they are also put to the national curriculum. Another way of this kind of incidents, which when the governing coalition honor awards those intellectuals who are proudly anti-Semitic. So these are the incidents, and just a quick sentence about the attitudinal level. There are surveys, of course, about anti-Semitism in the 90s. András Kovács, who did the most of the research on anti-Semitism after the regime change. In 1995, it was 17% of the population who harbored anti-Semitic attitudes. In 2011, when Jobbik was very supported and this network was very strong, it was 28%, and according to the last available data was made by Median, it's 20% of the population was strongly, and under 16% was moderately anti-Semitic, and this is in the last few years was not changing too much. What is also important to mention, however, that percentage of those who relativize or even deny the Holocaust is relatively high, 1 of 5 of the population and 9 of 5 of the population. There is no specific social demographic profile of those who harbor anti-Semitic attitudes, neither those who commit anti-Semitic acts. So it's also important that they don't have a specific profile. And a last thing about, to go back to the question of George Soros and the conspiracy myths around him, from 2017, Median asks questions about him, and in 2019, 57% of the population said that he was a selfish, power-hungry billionaire who is influential worldwide and cares only about his own financial and political interests. And the researcher found that I also agree with that there is something related to this anti-Soros campaign which is going on in the last few years in Hungary. I don't know if I have more time or it was enough. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Anikó, as well. You've mentioned during your speech that the number of bias-motivated hate crimes in Hungary is quite low, or rather low, but in this context, even 1 is a high number. But you've mentioned that these bias-motivated hate crimes is rather low. One of the explanatory reasons of this is definitely the high latency behind these crimes. We could also address these causes and reasons during our conversations if the member of the audience is interested at this topic. Right now, after the presentation, I encourage everyone to ask your questions. You can send it in the Q&A box, or you can use the raise your hand function as well. And while we are waiting for the further questions, we have already one, and I will quote it word by word because it's quite complex, maybe difficult, and partially theoretical, partially practical question. So I will address you this question word by word, and it's open for all of you to answer. So, an aspect of othering and creating a sense of the righteous us and the threatening them is defining groups as an exclusive community that is not truly integrated into the true nation. Within Europe, however, communalism and multiculturalism versus an integrated yet diverse national body seems to be the normal way of dissecting society, for example, a majority culture coexisting with separate, cohesive minority cultures. Is this a correct perception? If so, does this communalism versus the sense that there is a single community in which diversity is valued exacerbate the tensions between communities? Is Europe moving toward maintaining separate communal identities or towards a single identity in which diversity is valued? So actually, we have already 3 questions, and the floor is open to answer. So if you would like to answer this question or comment, then please do so. And the first speaker who will unmute herself can answer first. Henny?
Yes. I always looking for opportunities when I can be first in something and privileged. And I'm so glad to admit it every time. I'm not even sure that these are questions for answer. These are questions for discussions. It's so interesting. So I was thinking about it, and not just in a European context. Like, is there anywhere in the world where, like, any settings in which there are no othering, so us and them? I don't. It's not just communalism and how, or multiculturalism. So even in North America, if we see otherism, it's very, in a sense, exclusion works very, very similar in all the settings and othering. And I was thinking about, I definitely don't have enough knowledge, I think, on European policy and an over European Union view on the directions of the Union. I think what I see, or I have more knowledge about, the single countries that have considerable Roma population, how they approach to inclusion, and or they do not approach inclusion and rather exclusion. So how we went from integration to assimilation, integration, and got to inclusion, but still don't get the concept of inclusion when it comes to Roma, or actually any other minorities in Hungary. For example, I'm just also, so it's a discussion, I told you so. For example, I cannot pronounce. Institutionalizing separate national minorities in the Hungarian constitution. I'm thinking in, it's a new one. So I don't understand the institutionalizing separate national minorities into the Hungarian constitution. Can we unmute ourselves? So is it a rule that it has to be written?
No, actually, this is what I want to
please,
suggest.
Andre, please.
Mr. Good Friend, if you want, you can
Yes.
Unmute yourself.
Sorry for it being such a complex question, but I think it's provocative for discussion. I mean, you were noting, Henriett, in your response that are there any societies where we don't create other identities? And yes, I agree with you that globally and in North America as well, clearly there is othering taking place, the creation of exclusionary communities, us versus them, but it's not seen as the norm or the desired structure of the society. The desired structure of the society, at least in the United States, is one of an integrated, diverse society. In Europe, there is more of a sense of exclusive national identities and exclusive communal identities, so that the discussion of multiculturalism versus an integrated, diverse society takes place. Multiculturalism being communities existing side by side, and it could be, in this case, we could talk about LGBTQI community, Roma communities. But you'd asked, is there that when you, the reason why I added my additional comment with regard to the national minorities in the Hungarian constitution was when you noted that you weren't sure about European policy. And so noting that within the Hungarian constitution itself, rather than talking about a single Hungarian nation, it identifies clear, separate national national communities, which institutionalizes a sense of us and them, to my mind. And is that is that the norm? Is that the desired norm? Does that create tensions when we create these separate communal identities? Or is that a way to protect these different communal identities and safeguard their rights? Whereas in an integrated society, I suppose one could say that their identities might get subsumed into the larger majority culture. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let's go back to Henny to answer or to react, and then, as I see, Anikó would like to react as well. So then, after Henny, Anikó, you can react as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for clarifying. So, for me, institutionalizing national minorities, it's a chicken or egg situation. So when it comes to your question, if it deepens the otherness or not, or reproduce it, because for me, from the perspective, for example, of hate-motivated crimes, the problems exist, so we have to create legal possibilities for protection. So it is a really interesting question, but again, for me, it's a chicken or egg situation. If the otherness were already there, and we have to create, it's an interesting theory. If we would like consider Hungary as a nation, that would be wonderful. I would be the more. I think probably for me, it's a utopian idea. Given the last 600 years for Roma in the country, and especially in the context of, and I don't want to go deep into the whole lack of home country situation with being a nationality in the country among the nationalities that have a home country and being an ethnic minority that doesn't have a country. So they don't even, they cannot even tell us to go home because we are home. So, and there was one more thing that I wanted to point to. Oh, yes, the intention of the country itself, what it wants to create. That's a very interesting. And from the European policy level, like it's clear from the Hungarian intention that Hungary wants to have communalism, wants to be separate, wants to be very, very have its own everything, and except the EU money. So, but everything else is not needed in the Hungarian context of creating our Hungarian identity within the international community, which also has an element of like try to unify at the same time.
Anikó?
Yeah, many things was said by Henny. So about the minority rights and why is in the, we call it constitution now, it's a basic law, so a fundamental law. So but previously, as far as I remember, I don't remember, but I know that in the 90s when these minority rights were created and were put in the constitution, there was a good thing, and on one hand, maybe it's obvious, but on the other hand, it was also kind of proving that Hungary is caring about these minorities, to show it to the neighboring countries to care about the Hungarian minorities there. So there is another element of this kind of minority rights, what the relation between them and what is the real motivation behind them. So it's also just an element to add to your thinking. I was thinking about this, and of course in a European context, for me, if minority rights would work well, it could help the communities, and I think in this way this European frame could work, and it's I'm not sure that it's because of the different contexts it can compare to the US context, but it was just thoughts that came to my mind.
And just before we are going to Bea, maybe Anikó, you would like to react this comment as well, that and yet the Jewish community choose not to be identified as a national minority.
Yeah, it was another decision, so it was made by other factors. That's why they chose why the Jewish community chose this one. So I think it's also a special case as the ethnic minorities case, which are, I would divide from the national minorities position. But it's true.
And then finally, Bea.
Yeah, thank you. To go back to Andre's question, I when thinking about the different approaches to diverse societies, I see a strong division between, on the one hand, the US approach or American approach to integrated by diverse society, and the European multiculturalist approach, and on the other hand, between a social vision based on exclusion that is characteristic of the Hungarian social vision promoted by the government since the last 11 years, a long time. It's a vision that is defining what is Hungarian as against various ethnic groups, which is completely absurd in a country which is basically a political nation. It's a big melting pot of different nationalities, but still the very essence of being Hungarian is defined by the government as against all other ethnic groups, or defining Hungarians as anti-LGBTI, anti-European Union, civil society, somehow participating in civil societies also, or any sort of critical approach to government is also completely non-Hungarian. So it's a very, very strong dividing line there between the approaches of whether we actually think about other groups, the others, the non-favored groups as still existing groups, or whether we think about them as only as problems that disturb us and that are basically not us. That's what makes, I think, Hungary so kind of unique in the European Union.
Thank you. I have to say that our speakers are not in a very easy position today, because we've got very difficult questions to answer. So before the second quite complex question, I would like to pass the virtual microphone to István, who is the chairman of the Hungarian Europe Society, who has a short comment and not a question, and then we will continue with the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Erik. I would like to have a short comment as a participant in this discussion, not as a chairman or whatever. Just to make it clear that I think that what the three speakers started with, these are very important issues, that these are human rights issues and abuses of human rights and discrimination and all the other problems that they mentioned against collectivities inside the nation, if you want, or inside the Hungarian people, although it's not a Hungarian problem, it's a more general problem in neighboring countries or all over in Europe. But I think what Andre Goodfriend rose as a problem, it's also very relevant that what about our multiple identities? And in this sense, the Jewish case, what was mentioned, that there is nothing like a Jewish representative in the Hungarian constitution, and these were the Jewish, mostly religious or secular associations which did not want to have something like a special Jewish representative in the Hungarian parliament compared to other national minorities. It shows that it's a very special case, and every single issue or single group has its own historic roots, how they try to defend their own identities and rights. So that's I'm sure that in the case of the Roma people, it's a very different issue, and we are all Hungarian citizens, so there is a legal background why they can protect themselves. So even if there are smear campaigns and anti-gypsy campaigns or whatever campaigns, anti-Soros campaigns, there is a legal background, even in Hungary today, to try to defend their collective rights and identities, whatever happens on the political surface. So it's not the same anymore in an illiberal democracy, but still something is still with us. But what I want to say that, and it's more a question, I try to turn my comment to a question, following Andre Goodfriend's question, that what about the whole society where there are different identities and groupings, but in a maybe in a desirable world, we would like to have a political community and a society where there are many issues which also bind us together. So where does it end when a group or an individual emphasizes its or his or her own special identity, protecting their fundamental rights? And when does it begin when we all belong to the same bigger community, Hungary, nation, Europe, the world, humanity, whatever? So this is my very easy question for our panelists.
I promised a short comment from your side, and finally, it's quite a difficult question again at the end. But now I would like to ask our panelists to react, even to István's comment, or even to the question. Henny?
Yes, and I go for it. I was waiting if anyone wants to step in, so I wouldn't
I was just
take it
realized
again.
that you you are willing to unmute yourself, so then it's your.
Thank you. I'm not even sure it's such a difficult question. First of all, I think we have human rights, universal human rights that give an answer for when it starts to be part of the bigger community, and when it starts to be to leave your or identity, and so for me, what is really important when it comes to Roma, and it also connects to your comment, so react on like we wouldn't go far with the legal regulations in Hungary when it comes to Roma, like the institution you mentioned, the special representative in the parliament, was clearly appointed by the government. In the first 2 years, he had like 4 comments, and 18 in the second 2 years of his time in the parliament. And I wish he wouldn't have talked at all, because basically he was praising the government for its work for Roma, which is like how wonderful it was. And no one ever done that much for the Roma community in Hungary than the current government. So when it comes to Roma, but it's also very important when it comes to our identity and when to be part of the big community is that the lines were defined by others. It were never defined by Roma. And I think that's a very important aspect that connects to anti-Gypsyism, that the narratives about Roma was always formed by non-Roma. History, everything, sociology, everything was formed about non-Roma. And that's why what I do in Romaversitas, we believe that for Roma emancipation, it's a precondition to have a strong have strong Roma intellectuals who shape those narratives and who advocate for their communities, right? So they set those limits where we are living our identity and where we are part of that big community. So I think that's my identity-based approach, and the other one is the legal approach, that human rights set a limit for that. And I always use a very very simple example for the narratives. There is a box what people think a Roma person is, and if you don't fit into the box, sorry, I was disconnected. So if you don't fit into the box, that you stop existing as Roma. So, and that's the box what is we are expanding right now, I think.
Thank you, Henny. I think it was extremely interesting, and it's extremely important what you've mentioned, that how is the narrative about Roma is formed, and this narrative is based on the Roma community's views and comments or the non-Roma community. I think it's an extremely important aspect what you've highlighted, so thank you for this. I don't know whether Anikó or Bea would like to react. If no, then we have another question, which is very close to my heart as well, because the Hungarian Europe Society was dedicated many programs, events, even years for the question that what can the European Union and the EU institutions do related to the Hungarian democratic backsliding and populism, illiberalism, hybrid regime, whatever we call it. And related to our closer topic today, there's the question that what is the role of the European Union in rectifying the human rights challenging practices that you were referring to, our speakers were referring to? So maybe in an easier way, or reframing the question, what is the role of the European Union? What can the European Union do? Maybe we can start this question with the LGBT community, if Bea would like to react, especially because we have some previous examples and experiences with the LGBTQ free zones in Europe, that in Poland. So what can the EU do?
That is a difficult question. It seems there has been discussions going on about this, and of course there are various ideas and institutional steps discussed, but no clear-cut solutions, definitely. So it's the LGBT-free zones do exist. There's this. It's a very complex question of how the EU can, in what ways it can interfere with national legislation, and especially in these cases when there are countries that do not respect the fundamental charter, and of course there are no clear ways of challenging these human rights violations, but there are definitely steps. It's not the EU, but there are also other European institutions like the Council of Europe, the European Council of Human Rights, but also the Court of the European Union, that can, at least to some extent, formulate or step in when the government wants to do something that is very strongly violating the rights of minorities. Of course, it's a long time, a long procedure. It takes years. It needs an individual applicant or an organization as an applicant. and it takes a while, but still there are positive decisions which at least force the state to react, to answer, to provide answers, and that can again be challenged. There are the structural funds for civil society organizations, which are also for us, they are very important, as otherwise we would not be able to exist. And of course there's this complex situation of the government's relation to the EU, but when we, for example, want to train professionals, it is still an argument that that a project or a program is funded by the European Commission, then somehow it seems that at least some authorities like the police or various state authorities feel that they are compelled to react, to participate to some extent. And also the EU institutions, again, going back to the courts, the court system also can play a role in this, the consumer protection issues that I talked about. And they are both consumer protection and freedom of speech issues. So on the one hand, not much and much. So it always feels slow, and as these court cases take really years to end. But this constant checkpoint that the government is faced with or needs to have a discussion with, at least to some extent, is also extremely important.
And maybe you don't agree with me, but for me it seems that even some members of the European Parliament and the Commissioner Dalli is even more active than during the last couple of years. So maybe we can see some signs, some hopes from the side of the European institutions as well, that there are some willingness to change. There are some signs that they are active. They are more active in the field of equality and human rights than before. And for me, in this context, for example, the role of Commissioner Dalli is quite a good example. So maybe we will see that what's going on, what will be happening in the next couple of years. But at least for me, it seems that there's a hope for the change. Henny used the raise your hand function, so please go ahead.
Thank you. I just also wanted to comment on the EU role and on Bea's modesty when it comes to the EU's role. I mean, I'm always kind of confused when we get this question, because do you criticize the only institutional settings that you can still hope in a country? Like it's always a question for me, because yes, the legal paths, yeah, undoubtedly are still very useful for our communities. What is, I think, also very important is when it comes to Roma, I think it's not a secret that historically we have a terrible advocacy skills. It's just from the whole historical structural racism thing. Just, yeah, it's always like, I always say that the biggest tragedy of the Roma community is lack of information. It's always the last community that hear from everything, like funds, news, legal action, everything. So yeah, so I think it's a very EU institutions play a very important role when it comes to legal protection, the actual legal protection. Also keeping the Roma on agenda. Like it's just every year we just cannot emphasize enough just to keep the topic on the agenda is the biggest contribution to Roma advocacy. The other one is public shaming. I don't know if it still works in international community, but I remember when I studied about in human rights and international law, that was like the role of international institution is as public shaming each other. I have no idea if it still works in the case of Hungary or it just became shameless. And the third one is financial sustainability that Bea also mentioned, that is really important in case of most of the organizations. Honestly, in the case of Roma organizations, it's not, because we have barely access to direct EU funds given our sizes. And we all know that we don't have access to EU funds that come through the Hungarian government, and I'm pretty sure that our Polish colleagues can say the same thing. So that's definitely a challenge that the EU. I see a role for EU institutions to change, to make access to our minority organizations to the funds that actually on paper spent on our communities. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Anikó.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to say something to the previous question too, so I will try to embed it to this. Because I think in case of anti-Semitism in Hungary, which I hope that it's just was illustrated somehow in my presentation, it's many things are a bit abstract and not direct discrimination, not physical assault, and so it's not that visible, and that's why the remedies are different maybe, and it's different or more difficult sometimes to understand the context and do things, and it's relate and this kind of feeling that the Jewish community has, which was shown, for example, in the Fundamental Rights Agency report, that there is a certain feeling threatened and feeling insecure. It's not because Jewish people are directly discriminated, but this kind of atmosphere which is created around the issues related to the Jewish community and the memory politics. So this kind of issues in the European level, it's a bit tricky. Because if we see the European levels politics around, regarding anti-Semitism, we see that there are many efforts, like plenty of things, initiatives, education. Katarina Forsch-Nurbein, who is the coordinator for combating anti-Semitism. The IRA definition is used many ways, which is the working definition of anti-Semitism. And Hungary also adopted it, and we see here great harmony between the government and the European level. But when it comes to the concrete examples of anti-Semitic acts that I mentioned in my presentation, it's really hard to see it from the point of view, for example, from the IRA definition, because the IRA definition is not specified on this kind of cases. So it can be a good relation in this case, but the real problems are not shown in a way. And also the many initiatives are not really measured, in my opinion, in the Hungarian society, that we don't know exactly still that how if we talk more and more about the Holocaust, what will be the impact on the Hungarian students in the atmosphere when it's a competitive victimhood, and where is a highly politicized way of viewing these kind of questions. So the contextualizing of this kind of efforts would be important.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions, but I would like to ask you, all of you, in the order of presentations, just very briefly, even one sentence, tell us something which is positive, you are proud of, an achievement. So let's close this conversation with a positive, with some positive closing words. So, because we were talking about the problems, the causes, the consequences, the dramatic and terrifying situation. But now I would like to ask you to say some positive words, one sentence, whatever you would like to do, to close this conversation with some optimism. So first, Henny, please.
Thank you. I was thinking what I could say that would overarch our entire discussion, even Andrei's question and everything. And I think the most positive thing for me is to see intersectionality movements in our field, and I love to see how Roma LGBTQI youth actions are just growing across Europe, and it's becoming a strong movement. So that's definitely a positive thing in our field.
Thank you so much. Bea?
Yes, connecting to Henriett, I'm really grateful, and I also wanted to just speak about intersectionality. That of course these identities and groups are not separate. They have their intersections, and the positive thing is for me the work of so many advocates, so many civil society actors in all these fields, the work of the LGBTQI organizations, our work at Háttér. It's been really growing, getting stronger, and I just sometimes I simply feel just the sheer joy of working with a couple of dozens really devoted people who and making an organization grow even in these circumstances, so that we can maintain and even develop our services like the legal aid and the psychological aid services for the LGBTI community, our trainings. We hold lots of workplace equality, diversity and inclusion trainings, work with different professionals, even in schools, and on legal advocacy. And the trans community has become more visible because of the very negative circumstances since last year. But these all these people who dare to step in and take the responsibility of working for their communities give me lots of belief in the use of all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Anikó.
Yeah, I would also join to the other two presenters that there are many good things on the field. And I think it's very surprising that how many good initiatives are existing in Hungary, even though the circumstances are not the best. There are many enthusiastic people who effortlessly try to do the best that they can at the local level. So all the civil society actors, but also some, many teachers that now I'm interviewing teachers, and what I see that there are many local initiatives who are very creative and strong, and they don't have any support, but they do what they want, and talking about human rights and inclusivity. And so these are the good things. And I also hope, I also believe in the new generation. There are very fresh-minded people who are open and have a different narrative and a different division in their minds. So I really believe in them too.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for joining us today, and thank you for our speakers. We wish you strength for your work and a lot of successes in the future. And finally, let me just mention that the Hungarian Europe Society will be continuing its work as well, related to this webinar series. So at the end of May, we will organize our 6th webinar entitled Security Policy Challenges in the 21st Century, the Role of Big Power Politics in Central Europe. Just up until now, we will send you the invitations in time. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your contribution, and see you in the very near future. Good evening, or have a lovely afternoon.
Sziasztok, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.